A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corin. So we've had some great episodes lately chatting about all manner of topics related to the US military, some of the amazing equipment that they have and that they are repositioning into different locations around, not just here in the Middle East, but around the world. So we had a previous episode where we touched upon the concept of overseas military bases. And I think I mentioned that it was kind of an anomalous concept, kind of paradoxical. One of the definitions of sovereignty being asserting a monopoly on the use of force in your territory, it stands in kind of opposition to that, to allow a foreign power to base their military in your country. I've always thought it was kind of strange. And what made me think about this prompt in particular was reading the coverage over the past few days here about the different parts of the world where the US actually has these bases and where it's moving its assets to. Places I would never have guessed that the US operates military bases. Spain and Portugal being one where the Growlers were moved to. But we also have France, Germany, and in this region, I believe, Qatar and Jordan, among other countries. What I find interesting, Herman and Corin, is that the places where the US has these overseas bases doesn't necessarily always equate to countries where you'd think the US would be allowed or enabled to position these locations. You would think that you'd have to be a close ally of the US, but not all these countries, I think, really fit into that picture. I asked our colleague in ChatGPT whether which countries have overseas military bases in the first place, and if the US is the biggest network. So it says the US is biggest by far, with 750 in approximately 80 countries. That statistic, which we should double check, is extraordinary. That's more than half of the UN member states have a US military base on their soil. And the second one is also intriguing. It says Turkey with 133, UK 117, France about 7, Russia 29, China 6. So it's actually not a huge list of countries that operate overseas military bases in the first place. But the fact that the US has 750 is just crazy. I mean, we talked about the US military's internal plane network, forward logistics site. So they have this global presence that is absolutely astounding. But I'd love to chat today, Herman and Corin, about the history of these US overseas military bases. How long has the US been operating these? What's the usual setup and agreement mechanism? Again, looking at this from a sovereignty standpoint. And is that network, is it growing over time? And finally, the point I made about the relations that kind of have to be there in place in the background with all these kind of considerations of sovereignty and respect and security. What exactly is required for the operation of these to not only be established but to continue? Is it always a reciprocal or bilateral tie, or is there some element sometimes of coercion or even force in the US's ability to create these around the world? Herman and Corin, over to you.
Alright, we are jumping into a massive topic today. If you have ever looked at a map of the world and wondered why there are little patches of American territory scattered across every continent except Antarctica, you are not alone. It is a phenomenon that shapes global politics, economics, and security in ways that most of us barely notice until something goes wrong. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the history and the mechanics of United States overseas military bases. He is asking how long this has been going on, how the sovereignty piece actually works, and whether this network is still expanding. It is a big ask, but it is one of those things that defines the modern era.
Herman Poppleberry here. And Corn, I have to say, Daniel really hit on a fascinator with this one. It is one of those topics that feels like it should be simple. You just put some soldiers in a building in another country. But the deeper you dig, the more you realize it is this incredibly complex web of international law, historical path dependency, and strategic necessity. When Daniel mentions that it feels anomalous or even paradoxical for a sovereign nation to host another country's military, he is exactly right. In the traditional Westphalian sense of sovereignty, which has governed our world since 1648, the state is supposed to have a total monopoly on the use of force within its borders. So, when you bring in another military, you are essentially creating a legal and physical exception to that rule. You are carving out a space where the host nation's laws might not apply, and that is a huge deal.
It is like a glitch in the matrix of how we think countries are supposed to work. It is this weird overlapping of jurisdictions. But before we get into the legal gymnastics of how you actually set one of these up, let's look at the timeline. Daniel asked how long the United States has been operating these bases. I think most people assume this is a post-World War II thing, a byproduct of the Cold War and the fight against communism. But it actually goes back much further, doesn't it?
It goes back much further than the 1940s, Corn. If you want to find the true, weird roots of the American overseas-based network, you actually have to go back to the mid-19th century. Most people forget about the Guano Islands Act of 1856. This was a piece of federal legislation that allowed American citizens to take possession of unclaimed islands containing guano, which is basically bird droppings used for fertilizer and gunpowder. The U.S. ended up claiming over 100 islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean. While these weren't military bases, in the sense we think of them today, they were the first time the U.S. asserted a kind of appurtenant sovereignty over distant territories for strategic and economic reasons.
Wait, so the American Empire was built on bird droppings? That is the most my weird prompts fact I have heard all month.
It really was. But the real military transition happened in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. That was the turning point where the United States transitioned from being a continental power focused on its own borders to a global maritime power. After that war, the U.S. suddenly found itself in possession of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. It also gained a permanent lease on Guantanamo Bay in Cuba in 1903. That was really the first time the U.S. started thinking about coaling stations and stepping stones across the Pacific and the Caribbean. If you wanted a navy that could reach across the globe, you needed places to refill the coal bunkers. You couldn't just sail a steamship across the Pacific without stopping to refuel.
So, it started as a logistics requirement for the Navy. It was about the physical limitations of 19th century technology. But that is a far cry from the 750 bases in 80 countries that Daniel mentioned in his prompt. When did it explode from a few coaling stations into a global network?
The real explosion happened during and immediately after World War II. In 1940, even before the U.S. officially entered the war, there was a famous deal called the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. We actually touched on the diplomacy side of that in episode 497 when we talked about neutrality. Basically, the U.S. gave the United Kingdom 50 aging destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on land for military bases in British territories like Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and Newfoundland. That was a huge shift because it wasn't just about taking territory from a defeated enemy, it was a bilateral agreement with an ally. Then, as the war progressed, the U.S. built thousands of installations across the globe to support the war effort. At the peak of the war in 1945, the U.S. had over 30,000 installations worldwide, ranging from massive airfields to tiny radio shacks.
30,000? That is an incredible number. And then the war ends, and everyone expects the troops to come home. The greatest generation is supposed to pack up and head back to the farm. But they didn't, or at least a lot of them stayed put.
Instead of a total withdrawal, the Cold War began almost immediately. Those temporary wartime positions became permanent anchors for a new global strategy called containment. Decided that the best way to prevent another world war was to have a permanent presence forward deployed in Europe and Asia to keep the Soviet Union in check. That led to the creation of NATO in 1949 and bilateral security treaties with Japan in 1951 and South Korea in 1953. Suddenly, those temporary bases in Germany, Japan, and Korea became the foundation of a permanent global architecture, We went from occupying these countries to protecting them, and the bases stayed right where they were.
Okay, so that explains the why and the when. But let's get into the how, because this is where the sovereignty question Daniel raised gets really interesting. How do you actually negotiate the presence of thousands of foreign soldiers on your soil without it looking like an occupation? I mean, if I have a neighbor who decides to park his trailer in my driveway and live there indefinitely, we are going to have some very specific conversations about who pays for the electricity and what happens if he breaks my fence.
That is where the status of forces agreement comes in, or what everyone in the military calls a SOFA. A SOFA is basically a legal contract between the United States and a host nation that defines the rights and responsibilities of the U.S. personnel stationed there. It is not a treaty in the formal sense, it doesn't usually require Senate ratification, but it is a binding executive agreement. It covers everything from taxes and customs duties to the big one, legal jurisdiction.
Legal jurisdiction is usually the sticking point, right? That is the part that makes people the most nervous. If an American soldier commits a crime off the base in, say, downtown Seoul or an Italian village, who gets to put them on trial? Is it the local court or a U.S. military court-martial?
That is the most controversial part of almost every SOFA. Most of these agreements provide for some level of exclusive or primary jurisdiction for the U.S. military over its own personnel, especially for acts committed in the line of duty. But the specifics vary wildly. In some countries, the U.S. has almost total legal immunity for its troops. In others, like Japan or South Korea, the host nation has fought for and won more rights to prosecute soldiers for serious crimes committed off base, like assault or robbery. It is a constant tug of war between the U.S. wanting to protect its service members from foreign legal systems and the host nation wanting to assert its sovereignty and protect its citizens. We saw this tension boil over in the early 2000s in South Korea after a tragic accident involving a U.S. military vehicle, which led to massive protests and eventually a revision of how the SOFA was implemented.
It strikes me that these agreements are incredibly one-sided in a way. I mean, do we have any foreign military bases on American soil? Do we have a SOFA with Germany that allows German soldiers to have their own legal system in a base in, say, Texas?
We actually do have some foreign military presence in the U.S. for training purposes. For example, the German Air Force has a training center at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, and the Singaporean Air Force trains in Arizona. But it is not a reciprocal arrangement in the way Daniel is asking. The U.S. is not hosting thousands of foreign troops as a security guarantee. We aren't relying on the German Air Force to protect New Mexico from an invasion. The power dynamic is fundamentally different. This is why some scholars, like Chalmers Johnson, call it an empire of bases. It is a network that projects power outward from the center, but doesn't necessarily allow that power to be projected back toward the center. It is a hub and spoke model, not a web of equals.
Daniel also asked if this network is growing. The number 750 bases sounds like a lot, but I have read that the US has actually been closing a lot of the big old-school bases since the end of the Cold War. What is the current trend as of early 2026?
It is a bit of a yes and no answer. If you look at the total number of large, permanent installations, the ones with the Burger Kings and the high schools, that number has actually decreased since the peak of the Cold War. We have seen a process called Base Realignment and Closure, or BRAC, within the U.S., and a similar consolidation overseas. But, and this is the important part, the number of countries where the U.S. has a presence has actually stayed very high or even increased in some regions. The strategy has shifted from what we might call Little Americas, massive bases with housing, schools, and movie theaters, to something the military calls cooperative security locations, or more colloquially, lily pads.
Lily pads. That is a very evocative term. I am assuming that is one of our two allowed analogies for the day.
I will take it. Think of these lily pads as smaller, more austere facilities that don't have a permanent massive troop presence. Instead, they are maintained by a small skeleton crew or even a private contractor, and they are designed so that the U.S. can hop into them quickly if a crisis breaks out. They are less politically sensitive than a massive permanent base because they are less visible, but they provide the same kind of global reach. For example, in the Philippines, under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, the U.S. doesn't own the bases. Instead, they have access to specific Philippine military bases where they can build warehouses, fuel storage, and runways. As of last year, they expanded that to 9 different sites. So, while the footprint might be smaller in terms of square footage or permanent residence, the reach is arguably as wide as it has ever been, especially in the Indo-Pacific.
That makes a lot of technical sense. It is like the difference between owning a massive office building in every city versus having a bunch of WeWork memberships where you can just show up and start working whenever you need to. It is more flexible and cheaper to maintain. But what about the maintenance aspect Daniel mentioned? What does it actually take to keep a place like Ramstein Air Base in Germany or Kadena in Japan running?
It is a logistical Herculean task, corn. We are talking about billions of dollars every year. A large base like Ramstein is essentially a medium-sized American city transplanted into the middle of Germany. It has its own power grid, its own water treatment, its own schools, hospitals, and grocery stores. The commissaries and BX that stock American brands. The U.S. is own power grids. Department of Defense spends billions annually just on the operations and maintenance of these facilities. And that doesn't even count the military construction budget for new hangars or runways. There is also the environmental maintenance. One of the biggest issues right now is PFAS contamination, those forever chemicals from firefighting foam, which has become a major point of contention with host nations like Germany and Japan. The U.S. has to manage the cleanup and the legal liability for that, which is incredibly expensive.
And who pays for it? Does the US foot the whole bill, or do the host nations chip in? Because if I am Germany, and I have this massive American city in the middle of my country, I might feel like I am the one doing the favor.
That is another fascinating part of the agreement mechanism. It is called burden sharing. Some countries, like Japan and South Korea, pay significant amounts of money to offset the cost of hosting US troops. Japan, for instance, pays billions of dollars a year in what is sometimes called host nation support, or the Special Measures Agreement. They pay for the utilities, the salaries of local workers on the base, and even some of the construction costs. The argument from the US side is that these countries are getting a security umbrella. There is our second analogy provided by the US military, so they should help pay for the upkeep. During the Trump administration, there was a lot of public friction over this, with the U.S. demanding much higher payments, which shows how transactional these alliances can become.
The security umbrella concept is interesting because it implies that the host nation wants the bases there. But Daniel's last question was about whether these agreements are always reciprocal and bilateral, or if there is an element of coercion or force involved. That is a thorny question. Is it always a please stay and protect us situation, or is it sometimes a we are staying whether you like it or not situation?
It is the thorniest. If you look at Germany and Japan, the original bases were established through total military defeat and occupation. They weren't agreements in any meaningful sense in 1945. However, over the decades, those relationships evolved into voluntary alliances. Today, the German and Japanese governments generally want the U.S. presence there because it saves them from having to spend massive amounts on their own defense and provides a deterrent against neighbors like Russia, China, or North Korea. So, what started as coercion has become, in most cases, a mutually beneficial, if lopsided, partnership.
But it isn't always voluntary, is it? What about a place like Guantanamo Bay? That doesn't feel like a mutually beneficial partnership, given the current state of US-Cuba relations.
Guantanamo is the ultimate outlier. The U.S. has a lease on that land that dates back to 1903, and the terms of the lease say that it can only be terminated if both parties agree or if the U.S. abandons the base. Since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the Cuban government has considered the U.S. presence there illegal and has refused to cash the annual lease checks, which are for a paltry $4,085, by the way. They just sit in a drawer in Havana. But the U.S. stays because it has the military power to stay. That is a clear example of a base maintained through what we might call historical legalism, backed by force rather than active consent from the current host government.
And then you have the case of Niger recently, right? That was a big news story in 2024.
Niger is a perfect example of how these agreements can fall apart. The U.S. spent over $100 million building Airbase 211 in Agadez for drone operations. It was a key part of the counterterrorism strategy in the Sahel. But after a military coup in 2023, the new junta decided they didn't want the U.S. there anymore. They revoked the SOFA, declared the U.S. presence illegal, and by August of 2024, the U.S. had to completely withdraw. It shows that even with all the money and infrastructure in the world, if the host nation's government changes its mind and is willing to face the consequences, the U.S. usually has to leave. They aren't going to start a war with a partner nation just to keep a drone base.
What about the Chagos Islands? I remember seeing something about a major legal shift there recently.
That is a fascinating and very recent development. Diego Garcia is a massive U.S. naval and air base in the Indian Ocean, but the land is actually a British Indian Ocean territory. In the 1960s and 70s, the United Kingdom forcibly removed the entire local population, the Chagosians, so that the U.S. could build the base. For decades, this was a major human rights scandal. But in October of 2024, the United Kingdom finally agreed to a deal to hand over sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. However, the deal included a specific carve-out. The U.S., based on Diego Garcia, will remain under British jurisdiction for at least another 99 years. It is a classic example of sovereignty gymnastics. Mauritius gets the islands back on paper, but the U.S. gets to keep its base for another century.
It is like the landlord sold the building, but the tenant has a lease that lasts for 3 generations. It shows how much value the U.S. places on these specific geographic nodes. But let's talk about the requirement. Part of Daniel's prompt. Beyond the legal SOFA and the money, what is actually required to establish a new base today? If the US decided it needed a new lily pad in, say, Central Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, what is the process?
It usually starts with a diplomatic note or a memorandum of understanding. It is a quiet, high-level negotiation. The U.S. will offer something in return. Maybe it is a package of military aid. Maybe it is a favorable trade deal. Or maybe it is just the implicit promise of protection. In some cases, the U.S. doesn't even want a base in the traditional sense. They might just want access and overflight rights. This means the ability to land planes at a local airport, refuel, and take off again without a bunch of red tape. This is what they call places, not bases.
So the base is becoming more of a network of permissions, rather than just a physical fortress.
That is a great way to put it. In the modern era, the physical infrastructure is often less important than the legal and diplomatic infrastructure. If you have a treaty that says you can move troops through a country's territory on 48 hours' notice, you don't necessarily need to have 1,000 soldiers living there year-round. You just need the keys to the garage, so to speak. This is part of the Global Posture Review that the Pentagon does. They are looking for ways to be distributed and resilient. If you have one big base, it is an easy target for a long-range missile. If you have 20 small lily pads spread across 5 countries, you are much harder to knock out.
This brings up an interesting point about technology. As we get better at long-range strike capabilities, drones, and rapid sea lift, does the need for these bases go away? Or does the human element of having boots on the ground still matter?
Most military planners would say the human element is still irreplaceable for 2 reasons: deterrence and relationships. Deterrence works because a potential adversary knows that if they attack a certain area, they aren't just attacking a local military, they are hitting American soldiers. That tripwire effect is what has kept the peace in places like the Korean Peninsula for over 70 years. If there were no U.S. bases in South Korea, the calculus for North Korea would be completely different. And the relationship piece is about training. U.S. troops on a base are constantly working with the host nation's military, building what they call interoperability. You can't do that from a drone base in Nevada. You need to be there, eating in the same mess halls and training in the same mud.
It is also a massive economic engine for the local communities, which creates its own kind of stickiness. If you have a base that employs 5,000 local civilians and supports hundreds of local businesses, it becomes very politically difficult for the host nation to just say, "Get out." We saw this during the BRAC process in the U.S. communities fight tooth and nail to keep their bases, because the economic impact of a closure is devastating. The same thing happens in Okinawa or Germany. Even people who might dislike the U.S. military presence often rely on it for their mortgage payments.
It is a form of soft power and hard power wrapped into one. But we should also mention the darker side of how some of these bases are maintained, which touches on Daniel's question about coercion. We talked about Diego Garcia, But there are also cases where the U.S. maintains bases in countries with very poor human rights records because the location is too strategic to give up. Djibouti is the classic modern example. It is a tiny country in the Horn of Africa that hosts Camp Lemonnier, the only permanent U.S. base in Africa. But Djibouti also hosts a Chinese base, a French base, a Japanese base, and an Italian base. The government there is essentially an autocracy that has turned its geography into its primary export. They are the landlord for the world's superpowers.
It is a base economy. Djibouti has basically turned its geography into a subscription service. They are the landlord for the world's superpowers.
And that is a very different model than the Cold War model of you are either with us or against us. It is more transactional. It is more about what have you done for me lately. This means the U.S. has to work much harder to maintain its access. It is no longer a given. In the 2020s, we are seeing a shift toward what people are calling a multipolar era. If the U.S. pushes too hard on a host nation, that nation might just turn around and offer a base to China or Russia instead. We saw hints of this in the United Arab Emirates and even in some Pacific Island nations like the Solomon Islands.
So, to wrap back to Daniel's question about whether the network is growing, it sounds like the nature of the network is changing more than its size. It is becoming more transactional, more flexible, and in some ways more fragile, because it depends on these constantly renegotiated agreements rather than permanent occupation.
That is exactly right. If you look at the recent Global Posture Review, the focus is all on the Indo-Pacific. They are looking for new places to put lily pads in northern Australia, the Philippines, and Papua New Guinea. They aren't looking to build new Little Americas. They are looking for distributed lethality, the ability to spread out and move quickly. It is a response to the fact that large permanent bases are now very vulnerable to modern long-range missiles. If you have all your eggs in one basket like Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, a single strike can take out a huge chunk of your capability. But if you are spread across 20 smaller lily pads, you are much harder to hit.
It is a shift from a fortress mentality to a network mentality. I think that is a really important distinction for people to understand. When we talk about U.S. bases, we aren't just talking about walled-off cities. We are talking about a global logistical nervous system. It is the plumbing of global power.
And that nervous system is what allows for the kind of operations we talked about in episode 813 when we looked at carrier strike groups. A carrier is a floating fortress, but even a carrier needs a friendly port nearby for repairs, supplies, and shore leave for the crew. The bases are the nodes that make the rest of the military's global reach possible. Without them, the U.S. military would be a tethered force, unable to operate far from its own shores for very long.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. I think the takeaway for me is that the weirdness Daniel sensed is very real. These bases are legal anomalies. They are places where one country's law stops and another's begins, often in very blurry ways. They are the physical manifestation of a global order that was built in the 1940s and is now trying to adapt to the 2020s and beyond. It is a legacy of the 20th century that is being forced to evolve in real time.
And, for our listeners, it is worth thinking about how this affects the world you see. When you see a news report about a drone strike or a humanitarian relief mission or a freedom of navigation exercise in the South China Sea, none of that happens in a vacuum. It all relies on this invisible infrastructure of agreements, sofas, and lily pads that most of us never see. It is the physical scaffolding of the international system.
Well said, Herman. I think we've covered the ground on this one pun intended. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It really forced us to look at the how behind the headlines. If you are listening and you want to dig deeper into how the U.S. military organizes itself globally, I highly recommend checking out our episode 790, where we broke down the combatant commands. It is a great companion piece to this discussion because it explains the command structure, the who, that actually runs these bases.
Yeah, that one really helps put the where and who into perspective alongside the how we talked about today. It is all part of the same massive machine.
And hey, if you have been enjoying my weird prompts, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps the show reach new people who are as curious as you are about these weird corners of our world. We are trying to hit a milestone of 5,000 reviews by the end of the year, and every single one helps.
It really does. We love seeing the community grow and hearing your feedback.
You can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there, plus a contact form if you want to send us a prompt like Daniel did. You can also reach us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com. We read every single email that comes in.
We are on all the major podcast platforms, so wherever you listen, we are there.
All right, that is a wrap for episode 817. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, stay curious.
Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.